All right, let's jump right in, shall we? Today's deep dive takes us into the world of the Iroquois Confederacy.
Or as they call themselves, the Haudenosaunee.
Yeah, exactly, the
Yeah.
Haudenosaunee. And their story challenges a lot of what we think we know about pre-colonial America.
I think a lot of people would be surprised
Yeah.
to learn that it all started right here in what we now call upstate New York.
And we're talking about a system
Hmm.
of governance and diplomacy that was thriving centuries before European settlers arrived.
That's right. We often think of Native American societies as simple or primitive.
Right.
But the Iroquois, they were forging complex political alliances while European societies were still figuring out feudalism.
Yeah. It's really remarkable when you think about it that way, isn't it?
It really is.
And to be clear, we're not talking about a single tribe or nation here.
No, no, no. The Iroquois Confederacy, or Haudenosaunee, was an alliance of 5 distinct nations: the
Yeah.
Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk.
Okay, so 5 nations. And each of these nations, they held onto their own territories and identities, but they came together
Right.
to create this really powerful alliance that was unlike anything else in the region. So how did this confederacy actually come about? I mean, was it some kind of sudden peace treaty, or was it a more kind of gradual process?
Well, the truth is, it's probably a bit of both.
Yeah.
We have archaeological evidence that points to some pretty serious conflicts
Oh, wow.
between these nations in the mid-1500s.
Hmm.
Think fortified villages, signs of violence. It really paints a picture of a region that was grappling with a lot of instability.
So it wasn't exactly all peace and harmony from the get-go.
No, not quite.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to remember that for the Iroquois, peace wasn't something that you just sort of stumbled into.
Yeah.
It was something you had to create. You had to work at it.
Mm.
The Confederacy, with all of its rituals and its diplomatic protocols, that was their way of building peace in a world that they saw as inherently prone to conflict.
That's really interesting. So it was almost like a conscious choice, a deliberate effort
Exactly.
to create peace and maintain it.
That's right. And that brings us to, the story that always comes up when you talk about the Iroquois,
Mm.
the legend of the peacemaker,
Hmm.
and Hiawatha.
Oh, yeah.
It's a captivating story, no doubt about it.
I mean, it's almost mythical, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
And scholars still debate whether it's, literal history
Right.
or a blend of fact and allegory. But what we do know
Okay.
is that the peacemaker, or Diganawida, as he's also known,
Okay.
likely a Huron-Wendat man, he traveled across the 5 nations preaching this message of peace and unity.
Wow.
And his spokesperson, Hiawatha, helped him to spread this vision. They established these rituals and protocols that bound these nations together.
Yeah, I remember learning about the peacemaker combing snakes out of a sorcerer's hair.
Oh, right.
Right. And transforming him into this peaceful leader, such a powerful image.
It is a powerful image.
Mm.
It really captures the transformation that Diganawida was trying to bring about. But he also established these very real practices, like the rituals of condolence and requickening. Think of them as these really highly structured ceremonies
Okay.
that were designed to heal from grief and rebuild relationships after loss or conflict.
So they were very much grounded in the real world.
Very much so.
Yeah.
These weren't just, empty gestures.
Yeah.
They were the bedrock of Iroquois diplomacy.
Wow, that's really, really interesting. So it's this blend of symbolism,
Yes,
but also pragmatism.
absolutely.
Okay, so we've got this incredible story of the peacemaker, bringing these nations together, and we've got this emphasis on peace and diplomacy.
Right.
But we can't talk about the Iroquois without talking about the Longhouse,
Right.
right?
Right.
It's not just a dwelling; it's practically a metaphor
You got it.
for their entire society.
The Longhouse. The Longhouse was a remarkable feat of engineering
Yeah.
and social organization. These structures, they were common, from
Yeah.
the 1200s onward, and they housed these matrilineal extended families, meaning families trace their lineage through the mother's line.
Okay.
But here's what I think is really fascinating about the longhouses. The size of a longhouse. It often reflected the family's influence within the community.
Oh, interesting.
So you had this really direct link between physical space and social standing.
So the bigger your longhouse, the more clout you had in the community.
You got it.
Okay. That's amazing. But how does that tie into the Confederacy as a whole? Like how does this longhouse idea connect to the Five Nations coming together?
Well, the Iroquois, they didn't just build longhouses, they thought in longhouses.
Well, what do you mean?
I mean, they envisioned the entire Confederacy as this giant longhouse.
Okay.
The Five Nations, they were like families, occupying hearths within this vast metaphorical dwelling.
Yeah.
And the Seneca and Mohawk nations, they served as doorkeepers, responsible for defense. It's a brilliant way of visualizing both their unity and their shared responsibility.
Okay. I'm trying to wrap my head around this.
It's a powerful image.
It is.
This idea of a longhouse nation.
Yeah, it really is. So we've got these longhouses. We've got this idea of the Five Nations being like a family, and this concept of balance, of unity within diversity. That seems to be a really core Iroquois concept, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. The Iroquois, they didn't believe in a single all-powerful ruler or a strict hierarchy.
Okay.
Their system was much more nuanced, with influence stemming from a mix of lineage, personal achievements, and this is key,
Yeah.
diplomatic skills.
So power wasn't just something you inherited.
Yeah.
You had to earn it and maintain it.
You had to prove yourself.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So how did all of that translate into their actual governing structure?
Well, at the heart of the Confederacy, there was a council of 50 sachems, or leaders.
Okay.
And these sachems, they were chosen from the leading families of each nation.
Mm-hmm.
And this council, their names are actually documented in what's called the roll call of the founders.
Oh, wow. They actually have a record of this.
They do.
That's amazing.
And this council, they made decisions collectively,
Okay.
ensuring that no single nation could just dominate or dictate terms.
So it was all about balance and representation.
Exactly.
Really fascinating. And I think we need to talk about another really important aspect of Iroquois society, the role of women.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, they weren't just relegated to the sidelines.
Not at all. Iroquois women, they wielded a lot of influence. Remember how those longhouses, they were centered around elder women, their daughters, their families?
Oh, yeah.
Well, that gave them a tremendous amount of authority. And, what's also interesting is that it meant that you had related women and unrelated men living together in the same longhouse.
Yeah.
It created this really unique social dynamic.
That's very different from what we see in a lot of cultures.
It is, yeah.
So women were really at the heart of the home.
Right.
And by extension, the community. But did that translate into any kind of political power?
It did. While women didn't hold those official positions on the council, they did hold the power to choose who did.
Oh, interesting.
They elected the male sachems. So they had this really significant, albeit indirect, influence over leadership. And they could also call council meetings, organize war parties,
Wow.
even demand retribution for slain family members. Their voices carried a lot of weight.
It's such a stark contrast to the gender dynamics in most European societies at the time.
Oh, yeah.
It makes you wonder what those first European encounters with the Iroquois must have been like. I mean,
Well, I'm sure there was a lot of culture shock.
yeah.
Well, on both sides. But the Iroquois, they were incredibly skilled diplomats.
Yeah.
So I'm sure they figured out how to navigate these new relationships.
Yeah.
To their advantage.
I have a feeling we're going to get into that
We are.
in our next part.
We were.
So stay tuned for that. But for now, we're going to have to leave it there. This has been just a really fascinating glimpse into the world of the Iroquois Confederacy.
It really has.
And their incredible system of governance and diplomacy and social structure.
And don't forget the longhouses.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those amazing longhouses.
We'll have to talk more about those too.
We will.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Iroquois Confederacy. When we left off, we were talking about the Iroquois encountering Europeans for the first time.
Yeah, real clash of cultures. Imagine encountering a society that had such a different way of looking at the world.
And such a different system of governance.
Right, exactly.
I mean, how did they even begin to make sense of these newcomers?
Well, the Iroquois, they were incredibly adaptable, and they were also very, very strategic.
Okay.
They quickly realized that these Europeans, first the Dutch,
Right.
and then the English and the French,
Right.
they were powerful. but they were also rivals amongst themselves.
Oh, so they saw an opportunity there.
They did. And they were masters at exploiting those rivalries to their advantage. They engaged in trade with all sides.
Smart.
Very smart. Secured valuable European goods, things like metal tools, firearms.
Hmm.
And all the while, they very carefully maintained this balance of power.
So it was a delicate balancing act.
It was a very delicate balancing act,
Yeah.
but it allowed them to preserve a lot of their autonomy
For a time at least.
for a time.
But as European rivalries intensified, they must have come under increasing pressure, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they found themselves increasingly caught in the crossfire, pressured to take sides in these conflicts, wars over territory and resources. And a lot of these wars really had very little to do with their traditional way of life.
So they were being forced to fight for things that didn't even directly benefit them.
In many cases, yes. And you have to remember that the Iroquois Confederacy, as unified as it wasn't, a monolithic entity.
Right.
The Five Nations, they retained a degree of autonomy. And they didn't always agree on the best way to deal with these European powers. Sometimes individual Iroquois nations
Oh, wow.
forged their own alliances, even if it went against the wishes of the broader Confederacy.
That's got to create some tension.
It did. A lot of tension. And sometimes it even led to conflict within the Confederacy itself.
Are there any specific examples of that you can think of?
Well, yeah. The Beaver Wars of the 17th century, those are a prime
The
example.
Beaver Wars.
Yeah. This was a series of conflicts fueled by the fur trade.
Yeah.
And the Iroquois' desire to replenish their population after those devastating epidemics we talked about earlier.
Oh, right.
It was a brutal
Yeah.
and chaotic period. And it really highlights the complex dynamics that were at play within the Confederacy.
And you mentioned earlier the Iroquois' desire to replenish their population. I remember we talked about those morning wars.
Yeah, the Morning War.
It's not your typical concept of warfare, is
Yeah,
it?
no, not at all. I mean, the goal of these wars wasn't to conquer territory.
Okay.
It was to take captives.
Yeah.
And these captives, they would then be adopted
Right.
into Iroquois families
Yeah.
and communities.
I mean,
It was their way of coping
Wow.
with the immense loss of life that had been caused by those European diseases.
That's really fascinating. And again, it just shows you how different their worldview, their values were
Yeah.
from what the Europeans brought with them. So you've got these morning wars, you've got the fur trade, you've got European alliances. It sounds like the 17th century was a real pressure cooker.
It was a turbulent time.
Yeah.
But amid all the chaos, they managed to survive their system of governance, their diplomatic skills, their warrior traditions. All of it helped them to navigate
Yeah.
this increasingly complex world.
And then of course we have the American Revolution,
Right.
which throws everything up in the air again. So how did they navigate that particular conflict? Did they try to stay neutral, or were they kind of forced to pick sides?
Well, by the mid-18th century, tensions between Great Britain and its American colonies
Right.
had really reached a breaking point. And the Iroquois, they found themselves stuck in the middle,
Right.
facing a colonial power that they had grown to distrust, but also this burgeoning revolutionary movement with its own ambitions.
Right.
For westward expansion, it was a no-win situation for them.
It sounds like they were in a very similar position to the one they had been in before.
Right, caught between these two powerful forces.
So what did they do?
Well, officially, the Iroquois Confederacy, they declared neutrality at the start of the war in 1775.
Okay.
They knew that if they sided with either the British or the Americans, it would probably lead to more encroachment on their lands
Yeah.
and the erosion of their sovereignty.
So they tried to stay out of it completely.
They did.
Yeah.
But the divisions within the Confederacy, the ones that we talked about earlier,
Right.
they ran really deep. And despite this official stance of neutrality, individual Iroquois nations,
Okay.
they ended up being swayed by promises and pressures
Yeah.
from both sides. The Mohawk, they allied themselves with the British, hoping to preserve their lands
Okay.
with the help of what they saw as the stronger power. Others, like the Oneida and the Tuscarora, they saw an opportunity to ally with the Americans, hoping to gain some leverage in the future.
Yeah.
It really was a very difficult situation.
So the Confederacy was really torn apart.
It was. The American Revolution, it
Yeah.
tore the Iroquois Confederacy apart. It really did.
Mhm.
Pitted brother against brother in this conflict that ultimately benefited neither side.
So it was a real tragedy for the Iroquois.
It was a tragedy, and it was a
Do-
tragedy that they never really recovered from.
and after the revolution was over, I mean, what happened then? I mean, was that the end for the Iroquois Confederacy?
Well, the Confederacy, it never regained its pre-revolution unity.
Okay.
The war, combined with the ongoing land encroachment
Right.
by American settlers, it made it almost impossible for them to maintain their traditional ways of life.
So their world was irrevocably changed.
It was. Many Iroquois were forced to migrate westward, seeking seeking new lands and new opportunities.
Mm.
Others remained in their ancestral territories, but their lives were forever altered.
So it was a loss not just of territory, but also of their way of life.
Yeah, a loss of their political systems, their economies were undermined, their very identity was under threat.
It's just such a tragic story. But did they ever try to push back, to assert their rights in the face of all of
Oh,
this?
absolutely. They never stopped fighting for their sovereignty, even in a weakened state.
Okay.
They continued to be these incredibly skilled negotiators and diplomats.
Mm.
They formed new alliances,
Okay.
both with other indigenous nations
Okay.
and even at times with the American government itself,
Mm.
seeking to protect their interests
Mm-hmm.
and their future. One of the most striking examples of this is the Treaty of Canandaigua,
Yeah.
signed in 1794,
Oh.
between the Iroquois Confederacy
Okay.
and the newly formed United States government.
So tell me about this treaty. Was it a genuine attempt at reconciliation, or was it just another kind of broken promise?
Well, the Treaty of Canandaigua it's a really interesting document. And on the one hand, it was a remarkable achievement for the Iroquois. It formally recognized their right to their land,
Oh.
and it set the stage for what was supposed to be, a peaceful coexistence between the two nations. It was a moment of hope. It really was a recognition of their sovereignty
Yeah.
by the very power that was threatening their way of life.
Hmm.
But the history of treaty relations
Right.
between the United States and Native American nations, it's a very complicated history,
Right.
and it's full of broken promises
Yeah.
and betrayals. And while the Treaty of Canandaigua was a significant symbolic victory,
Hmm.
it was often undermined
Yeah.
by the actions of state governments and individual settlers who they continued to encroach on Iroquois lands.
So the fight for their land continued.
It did, and it continues to this day. But the Iroquois, they never gave up.
Hmm.
And that's really, I think, the key takeaway here.
Yeah.
They adapted, they resisted, and they fought to maintain their cultural identity in the face of incredible pressure.
And they've had a lasting impact,
Mhm.
haven't they? And not just on land rights,
Yeah.
but on American history and culture as a whole.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, beyond their direct political interactions, the Iroquois Confederacy has had a profound impact on American thought, American culture, their system of governance, their emphasis on consensus building, their deep respect for the natural world. These are all ideas that have resonated
Mm.
with thinkers and reformers
Yeah.
throughout the centuries.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Iroquois Confederacy. It's been quite a journey so far, hasn't it?
It really has.
I mean, from their origins in the forests of the Northeast to their sophisticated system of governance, to their really tumultuous encounters with European powers.
Right.
The story of the Iroquois it's one of resilience,
Right.
adaptation, and honestly, brilliance.
I think that's a great way to put it.
But despite all of that, despite the upheavals of the American Revolution and the fracturing of their alliance, the Iroquois people, they persevered.
They did. They faced immense pressure,
Yeah.
loss of land, the constant threat of cultural erasure. But they never gave up.
It's a story that I think really echoes the experiences of so many indigenous peoples throughout history. You know, this incredible strength and determination in the face of just incredible adversity.
Absolutely.
But I'm curious about the years after the revolution. What happened to the Iroquois Confederacy? I mean, when the dust settled, was it truly the end?
Well, as we discussed, the Confederacy, it never really regained its pre-revolution unity.
Okay.
The war, combined with the ongoing land encroachment
Mm.
by American settlers, it made it nearly impossible for them to maintain their traditional ways of life.
So it wasn't just about the physical loss of territory,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
also the erosion of their social and political structures as well.
Exactly. Imagine, the fabric of your society being pulled apart.
Yeah.
Many Iroquois were forced to migrate westward,
Okay.
seeking new lands and opportunities.
Oh,
Others remained in their ancestral territories, but their lives were forever altered.
so their political systems were disrupted, their economies were undermined, their very identity was under threat.
That's right.
It's a pattern we see repeated again and again throughout history, isn't it? The devastating impact of colonization on indigenous cultures.
It is.
But amidst all of this, were there any glimmers of hope, any instances where the Iroquois were able to push back, to assert their rights?
Oh, absolutely. The Iroquois, they never stopped fighting for their sovereignty.
Hmm.
Even in weakened state, they continued to be these incredibly skilled negotiators and diplomats.
Okay.
They formed new alliances, both with other indigenous nations and even at times with the American government itself,
Really?
seeking to protect their interests and their future.
So they never gave up on the power of diplomacy, even when facing such overwhelming odds.
They understood that the rules of the game had changed
Right.
and that they needed to find new ways to fight for their people.
Mm.
One of the most striking examples of this is the Treaty of Canandaigua,
Okay.
signed in 1794 between the Iroquois Confederacy and the newly formed United States government.
Tell me more about that treaty. Was it a genuine step towards reconciliation, or was it, kind of just another broken promise in a long line of broken promises?
Well, it's complicated, right? I mean, the Treaty of Canandaigua, it was a remarkable achievement for the Iroquois.
Oh.
It formally recognized their right to their land,
Hmm.
and it set the stage for what was supposed to be a peaceful coexistence between the two nations.
Okay.
It was a moment of hope, a recognition of their sovereignty by the very power that had threatened their way of life.
But was it actually honored? Did the United States live up to its end of the bargain?
Well, the history of treaty relations between the United States and Native American nations, it's a history full of broken promises and betrayals.
Right.
And while the Treaty of Canandaigua was a significant symbolic victory, it was often undermined by the actions of state governments and individual settlers who continued to encroach on Iroquois lands.
So the fight for their land, the fight for their very survival, it continued.
It did.
It's a tragic story that's all too familiar, I think, in the history of indigenous peoples.
It is.
But you mentioned earlier that the Iroquois Confederacy has had this lasting impact, not just in terms of land rights,
Right.
but on American history and culture as a whole.
Yeah.
So what did you mean by that?
Well, beyond their direct political interactions,
Okay.
the Iroquois Confederacy, it's left this really indelible mark on American thought and culture.
Okay.
Their system of governance, their emphasis on consensus building, their deep respect for the natural world.
Yeah.
These are all ideas that have resonated with thinkers and reformers throughout the centuries.
So their legacy extends beyond the realm of politics and treaties
It does.
and into the realm of ideas.
Uh-huh.
That's really fascinating. So you're saying that the very foundations of the United States might have been influenced by the Iroquois Confederacy.
A lot of historians and scholars believe that the Iroquois Confederacy, with its decentralized power structure
Right.
and its emphasis on balance and harmony, actually served as a model for early American thinkers who were, grappling with the formation of this new nation.
Wow, that's really incredible. Are there any specific examples of that influence that you can point to?
Well, Benjamin Franklin, for example, he was deeply interested in the Iroquois Confederacy. He saw in their system of governance a model for colonial unity,
Hmm.
and he even proposed a plan known as the Albany Plan of Union,
Okay.
which drew inspiration from the Iroquois system of councils and consensus-based decision-making.
And while that plan was ultimately rejected, the fact that it was even considered, I think, speaks volumes about the impact of Iroquois ideas on early American political thought.
It does. And it's not just in the realm of politics either.
Okay.
The Iroquois emphasis on the power of women in their society, that's also resonated
Yeah.
with social reformers and feminist movements throughout history. Their story serves as a reminder that alternative models of governance and social organization, they are possible.
Hmm.
models that prioritize balance, cooperation, and respect for all.
It's a really inspiring story, and I think it's one that we can all learn from today.
I agree.
So as we wrap up this incredible deep dive, what's the one key takeaway that you hope our listeners will carry with them?
I think for me, it's the reminder that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges, resilience, and ingenuity, they can prevail. The Iroquois Confederacy, it may have been fractured, but their story continues. They adapted, they resisted, and they fought to maintain their cultural identity, their values, and their place in the world.
It's a really powerful message, and I think it's one that's more relevant than ever today. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey into the world of the Iroquois Confederacy. It's been a real privilege to learn from you and to share their story with our listeners.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most remarkable chapters in American history.